Here I'm getting ready to connect to the default instance called Reno. And everything's working. So it opens up, and I've got my connection. What happens if not everything's perfect? Well, we learned that if the service isn't running, that we're not going to be able to connect. So let's simulate that. Let's right-click Computer and say Manage. Why? Because one of the nodes under Computer Management is Services and Applications. So let's go to Services, and let's find our default service. It's in the S's under SQL Server. The name of the service is SQL Server, and the status to the right is set to Started. If we right-click the service and select Stop, then SQL Server will not be able to accept requests from clients. We're going to test this by trying to connect to SQL Server with Management Studio as the client. When we click Connect, and we get this error message. Well, setting this up, it's clear what the problem is. We just need to start the SQL Server service. But to make it challenging, you're not allowed to use the Services node of Computer Management. And the place we're going to go has many configuration options. So, let's go to Start, All Programs, and then go to SQL Server 2012, choose Configuration Tools, and choose SQL Server Configuration Manager. Now, there's many different things we can configure, but the first one listed is the SQL Services. And notice for the Microsoft SQL default instance, it's stopped. It's not running like the other instances. Right-click the SQL Server service and start it. The SQL Server service is now running. Let's test it out by going to Management Studio and hitting Connect on the Connect to Server window. And we've successfully connected. In all of the examples demonstrated so far, it's been done while sitting at the SQL Server. In other words, the only thing that's sitting between me and the SQL Server right now is a keyboard and a mouse. But oftentimes in the workplace, you're going to be connecting to the SQL Server, working with the SQL Server, but you're not sitting at the SQL Server. It might be down the hall or even another building within your company. Internally, you would connect and manage SQL Server. Yet there are other times where you want to connect to SQL Server with a remote connection from home, or connecting from the internet to your company through a dedicated tunnel. If you're connecting over a local or remote network, you're going to have to use a network protocol that talks to SQL Server, and SQL Server is going to have that networking protocol enabled. That networking protocol is likely TCP/IP. If you're at the SQL Server, you don't need to go through the network to get to the SQL Server. You could use TCP/IP, but you're just going to go through the shared memory space that your computer and your SQL Server share. In other words, you're connecting through the computer itself. Local connections like to use shared memory to connect to SQL Server, and network connections like to use TCP/IP. If you disable the TCP/IP incoming connection into SQL Server, then the only way you can manage SQL Server would be to actually be at the SQL Server itself. As far as your clients are concerned, it looks like they have two choices and two different servers that they can connect to. Now you want to make sure that the default SQL instance of Reno is taken offline so that the clients can't connect to it. Since you're going to do some testing on it, you don't want Reno down, you just want it to be not available to network connections. So you want Reno to handle local connections while you do your testing. So we want to make it so that Reno has only the shared memory connection enabled and no other networking library protocols. And we'll make sure the Bogota named instance will have shared memory and TCP/IP enabled so they will continue to take client connections over the network. SQL Server Management Studio is open, but that's not where you manage networking library protocols. So we're going to open up the SQL Server Configuration Manager. On my system, it appears on the first menu because it's been opened recently. But you can also find it under All Programs, SQL Server 2012, Configuration Tools, SQL Server Configuration Manager. When Configuration Manager opens up, we see the services first. But we're not looking to start and stop the services. Our purpose is to check the networking protocols. On the left pane, expand SQL Server Network Configuration, and the protocols for the default configuration is listed first. And notice shared memory is turned on, and so is TCP/IP. We don't want TCP/IP turned on, so let's right-click and disable it. These changes will take place once we restart the service. We'll turn it back on after our day of testing is done, but for one full day, we're just going to want only shared memory connections, which is a local connection while at the server. Bogota, is everything up that we need up? Well, we want to make sure you can manage it locally, and we're also going to allow the clients to continue to connect over the network, so that's all set. Now, we got the notice that we need to restart the SQL Server service for the TCP/IP to be disabled. So we'll go up here, find the SQL default instance for the service, and we will right-click and restart it. And now, clients can't connect to the default instance over the network, but you can manage it locally. The Bogota named instance, that can be managed locally, or it can be managed by a SQL client. Remember this diagram where the SQL server could be connected to by shared memory if you're actually at the SQL server? But network clients, even if they're coming over the internet, are going to use the TCP/IP protocol. It's possible for the local client to use another network protocol called named pipes. That's not very common, so we're not going to go into that. But the only networking protocol that will work for local and remote clients is TCP/IP. Now, there's a lot of TCP/IP traffic going all over the place. And to reduce the confusion of what connections go where, we use something called a socket or a port. Now, think of a home with two TV sets. One person wants to watch Channel 5 and one person wants to watch Channel 11. You can do that on the same cable connection. The default SQL port connection when coming over TCP/IP is port 1433. The problem is firewalls are set up to block port 1433 from the external network. That's for security reasons. This means the internet clients must connect with a different port. If that's the case, you better tell SQL Server that there's another port that it will accept for client connections. We've noticed we can connect to the Bogota SQL instance while in our local network, but we're not able to connect to the Bogota instance of SQL Server coming through the internet. So management has decided to open up port 1024 to be a dedicated connection to the Bogota instance. The administrator says, please make this change on the SQL Server. Why did we choose port 1024? Well, it was one of just thousands of open ports set aside for us to use for any specific purpose that we need. In other words, we could say we just picked one of the many open ports that was free and decided what it was going to be used for in our network. We're already in the SQL Server Configuration Manager. So let's enable port 1024 just for Bogota. Click on Bogota, and its TCP/IP is the connection that will be coming in through. Let's get its properties. Click the IP Addresses tab, and on the port, type 1024, and click OK. It says this change will take effect once you restart. Let's accept that. Click on the SQL Server Services node, find the Bogota service, and restart it. Time for Lab 3.2, Skill Check 1. Take a moment to pause this video and challenge yourself to do this skill check. Skill Check 2. Take a moment to pause this video and challenge yourself to do this skill check. And that does it for Lab 3.2 on SQL Server Configuration Manager. Our next item, Lab 3.3, SQL Server Logs.